This lesson is going to be the ultimate practice lesson where we're going to be connecting to some endpoints and then dynamically loading the data onto the page. Now these endpoints are also going to have different data structures. You can see that here within the console. So they're not always going to be structured the same way. They're going to have different properties and values. So the objective is two-part in order to be able to troubleshoot the various JSON endpoints and how to handle those, and then also lastly, of course, how to output the content on the page and make use of the content. So as you can see, whenever I click the button, it's changing the endpoints, and this is going to be the final result of this lesson's project, where we've got some buttons connecting to endpoints and then dynamically adjusting and outputting the content on the page. Let's connect to some endpoints. So we've got our index.html file, so I've cleared out some of the values from the last lesson. So styling is clear now, and we're still using the same 4 elements within the body, and then linking out to a script file, and this is going to be app4.js. And then within the script file, I've got the button connectors, the output area, the value, and let me get rid of this one because we don't need to create the second input, and have the value for the input of just test, and then also the button click me, and whenever the button gets clicked, then we're going to make our request here. So I'll output into the console ready, and just to make sure that the button is working. So everything looks like it's good and ready to go. So let's make our request, and in this case we're going to be making a request to a few different endpoints, and I'll just be listing out the endpoints. So the purpose really is just to get some practice in on various endpoints. So we've got the URL here, and this is connecting to a JSON file. Also, just as always, just output the data within your web browser if you're making a GET request, and that way you can see that this endpoint is open and that we're able to access it. And you can also create local versions of these JSON files. So if you are having problems connecting to the endpoints, you can make the local versions of the JSON file. And just toggling the word wrap so we can see the full web URL. So let's make our fetch request to that URL. And I'll do that within a function. So it's going to make a fetch request to whatever the URL is that we're sending in there. And I'll just call this URLs. And then eventually we can turn this into an array if we want. So making the fetch request, so fetch to whatever the URL is. And then once the request is made, we get the response back and take the response as JSON. And that's assuming that it is within a JSON format. So as we saw last time, they might not all be JSON. So we have to be mindful of the fact that maybe returning it back as JSON, we might want to default it as text. And then when we see the data coming back, then we can just ensure that it is within a JSON format. And then also, let's add in a catch for any of the errors, as we're going to be trying out various web URLs. So some might have some issues or errors, and then we can debug the errors. So make the request and copy it, so when the button gets clicked, then we're going to loop through the URLs. So right now we just have the one URL. And click it, so ready, and we're returning the content back. So let's create it as a JavaScript object. So using the JSON parse, that can turn the data into a JSON or JavaScript object. And let's see what that looks like. So the data is going to stay the same, but we're just outputting it. So that looked like that worked. We've got our array that we can loop through, so it's the books array. So let's update this parameter, and we'll create an object out of it. And within the object, I'll have one value for property of URL. And if you want to proper structure it as JSON, you do need to use the double quotes, but because this is in JavaScript, I'm using single quotes. And for the array is going to be located at books. So that's going to be the path to the array. So select the first URL. And we'll just create a temporary of URLs 01. And we're not going to send over the request yet until we can make sure that our local data is structured properly. So within the temp, and we've got the URL there. So let's send this data over to the my URLs. And this is just going to be returning back the object. So out of the object, we need to create a URL. So it's going to be located within the my object URL property. So make the fetch request to the my object URL. And now we'll console log the value of the JSON and using the bracket notation. And this is where the bracket notation is sometimes better because it provides more flexibility. So I can take the my object and I can use the array string value to see what we log out here. So within the array string, that's where we're outputting that. And let me comment out some of this excess. So that gives us the array and allows us to locate the array, and we can dynamically track all of this within an array and have that locally, so allowing the users to be able to loop through the various web URLs. And I'm also going to add one more value there. And I'll just call it books list. And we are going to be using that as we're going to be constructing the endpoints using this object and then sending it over, adding the event listeners to those endpoints. So let's create another one, same structure. And structure is really important when it comes to the JavaScript objects. So let's select another endpoint. And in this case, we'll use the endpoint for people. And this can be something like a friends list or something like that. And we don't know what the array is yet. So we want to have an opportunity to still output the content from the fetch request. So let's update the index value here to URLs 1. And then we'll also update the URL here that we're sending to. So let's see what happens. So we're going to fail because we're making a connection. We're still returning it back as a JavaScript object here, but we do have a problem here where we're trying to get the array out. So let's fix this, and then so we can do our debugging here and then make that dynamic. And let's take the endpoint and try it within the web browser first. So this is what we're returning back, and the array actually should be within data. So we should be able to return that information back. So let's see what's going wrong here. We'll do some troubleshooting and debugging. And comment out some of this excess. So this is what we're getting returned back. And it does look like it's It's a string value. So let's output the JSON object. So it's having a problem parsing this as JSON. So if you do encounter this, double check to make sure that you've got JSON data that's valid JSON data. So it is valid JSON data. And let's just create a file of it. And I'll call it JSON for JSON. So that will give us an opportunity to adjust that if needed. JSON for JSON. And that's where we're going to make the fetch request to. So this one looks like it's a little bit difficult to troubleshoot, as it doesn't make any sense that we're not able to output it, but when we create a JSON file, we are. So that secret really is within the source code of the file. So when we go over to the onepeople.json, we look into the source, and immediately we notice that this is going to be HTML content. So it's not going to be presented as JSON content. And that's a problem. Even though the extension is JSON, there is an issue here. So looking at the web page, and open up the source, the inspect elements, and then from here we can see what the problem is, that it's got a lot of these character spaces for providing the structure, and that's we're not able to see that visibly, but that's within the code. So it's got all of these spaces here, so we need to strip out these extra spaces from the string value and before we try to convert it into the JSON object. And with typical string, you can also notice as well that if this was a typical string, there wouldn't be any of these spaces that we can convert into JSON. So this is already structured with the spaces, and that's why when we copy it, it works. When we paste it into the lint, it works. But when we try to connect to the JSON file online, it doesn't work because of those excess spaces. So let's go back in, and we're going to load that page content one more time, and we want to strip out the extra spaces from the string data. So we're turning it back as text and outputting the text content. So that's our text content. So we want to remove out all of these extra spaces that are currently within the text content in order to structure it as JSON. So let's create a temporary holder for the data. And then take the data and use replace. So replace the spaces, which is blanks. So remove out all of that. And let's see what we get return back in the value. And even better than using the character for these hidden spaces, let's remove it out using a regular expression. So this will strip out all of the excess spaces using the regular expression and allow us to clean the structure of the JSON file. Because here we don't see all of this extra data, and when we validate it, it restructures it properly. So now we've removed out the excess white space from the data. And now let's parse the value over and see what we get as JSON. So now it works. We're able to use the JSON data and from here, we're able to loop through and iterate through the data. So we had to do a small cleaning of the content, before we're able to access and use the data. So this actually isn't a good example because this structure isn't going to fit properly with what we're trying to do. And this was just an example of the different endpoints and some of the problems that you might encounter. So if you do encounter this type of problem, look at the source code and check to see what could be causing and what could be creating the proper JSON structure. So let's try another endpoint. And this endpoint has the same data, but we notice that we don't have the line space formats there. So let's update this URL. And we'll try it going directly to the data content. And now it works, and this is going to look the same way as what we've got within our JSON file, and we don't have any of the spaces, so we don't have to worry about removing them. And the reason that we're not going to use that particular endpoint is that if we have to remove out all of the spaces, we don't want to be removing out spaces in case some of the content has spaces. Now there's more complex regular expressions that you could remove out that have just spaces outside of the quotes as well. So you could look to some of those more complex regular expressions, but I did want to focus on troubleshooting and getting data from the endpoints within this course. So we're not going to get too far into the regular expressions, but there is a way, and that's how you can troubleshoot and just make sure that your content, even though it looks well within the web URL, just take a second look and look at the source code and make sure that the source code is clean. And this way you can take the content and you can directly parse it out as JSON. So if you do encounter any of those errors that we saw, that just means that the JSON that we're trying to parse is not properly structured JSON. So our array for this case is going to be the people. And now we can make a more dynamic way to loop through the data, because at this point we know that we've got the people object and we can loop through the people array. So let's see what we've got here. And we can output the people array here. So this gives us an opportunity where we can change the index values, and we can update and output the array objects dynamically. So let's add in one more endpoint that we can practice, and then we'll dynamically output and generate all of these endpoints. So this is just going to be a cryptocurrency endpoints, and this is going to be our URL. So I want to make sure I get the structure proper, so I'm going to copy and paste the URL, and then I'll copy it into the new URL for the list. And it looks like our initial array is going to be data. So we'll see what we return back here. And let's update the URL and also update it within the button event listener. And click the button. And it does look like we're able to get the content there for the different IDs. So the structure is done properly, and it is within the data array. So it's status, and this is the one that we want to loop through. So we want to loop through the data array and output some of those values that are within the data array. So now that we've got the ability to dynamically select by index value and select the object array, we can parse through there and loop through there and output it onto the page. So let's add that option in. And this is going to be a function. We'll give it a name of maker. And it's going to take in an object value for the array. So this is just simply going to be passed in. And then we'll console log the array. And we'll do the array length just to make sure that we do have an array. And for each, we want to loop through each one of the items in the array and output them in the page. So first thing we want to do is output them into the console, and then we'll output them onto the page. So that gives us a listing of the items that we have there. I'm going to also comment out some of these console messages, so to avoid any of the confusion. So that's going to focus on the array. So there we've got our length, and we've got the array data. So ideally we want to just output and loop through all of the properties that we've got within the object. Now that we're returning back each item within the array, and this is all dynamic, so it doesn't matter which endpoint we're connecting to, the paths and the data is going to be all different, but we're always looping through an array. So we want to make it flexible enough that we can take this object and list out all of the property names that we have here. So we can do that with another for loop that's contained within the for each loop, and this one is going to just pull out the object contents. So object contents, and we'll pull it out as an object of, and we'll check for the entries that are within the object, and console log the contents that we have of the object. So let me comment that out and click. And because this is an object, let's select the element entries, and using the object entries. So let's see what we get returned back. So that gives us an array of each one of the property key and then the value that's associated with the key. And you can also separate this out as well and call it entries. And depending on how you want to present the structure of your code, so you can just do it like that way as well, entries. And if you want, you can also console log out what we've got for entries. So when we do make that request, we get that initial array of all of the items. So that means that we can then loop through this object and output the contents that are contained within the object. And we don't actually have to loop through because the structure is always going to be the same. So these are array based, so the first item in the array is going to be the property name, and then the second one is going to be the value that's associated with it. So let's take output and just clear out the current inner HTML and select the inner HTML, and using the backticks for the template literals, I'm selecting the object, which is an array, and selecting the first item, and then the second item is going to be the value. So that's going to be the key, and then that's going to be the value that's associated with it. And then we'll just add to the HTML and create a line break between them. So let's see what we got now. So it looks like we're able to output the content, and we need to break between each one of those. So also let's create a div to create some structure. So using the document, create element, create the div for the page, and then output append the newly created div to the page. And then within the div, we're going to update the inner HTML. So set the inner HTML. And just do a properties count or something like that. And it could take entries and get the length value of entries. You could also use the backticks as well. And actually this isn't going to be output, it's going to be the div. And we're going to be updating the div values that way. So properties is 8, and see what we've got. So it's adding the new line. And let's also separate out and add a class. So using class list, add a class to the div, and go to index, and let's set up some padding and also border, and set a width. So use 80, whatever, you can set whatever width makes sense for you. and then for margin as well, and then auto for right and left so that it centers. So this one is actually still has an object within that object. So you can also try to detect that, but this purposes of this, we just want to demonstrate that we should be able to switch the index values, and that should return back and output the contents of the various endpoints. So it looks like everything is working properly, and we can dynamically output the contents of the endpoints. So let's do one final thing where we're going to loop through all of the URLs on the page and then create buttons for those. So URLs for each, and that's going to be for each one of the elements. So let's update them and add them to the page. So creating a button, and I'll call it button 1, using the document create elements, and creating the element is going to be a button. And then clicking these buttons, it's going to launch into the URL there. And I'll use we'll select the H1 and we'll populate the content in there. You could also create another element to output content too. So just to save some time, I'll select the H1 and H1 append each one of these buttons to the page. So there's our buttons. We need to have some content on the button. So within the console, I'm going to output the contents. And this, remember, this is coming from our URLs. So we're updating and outputting the URLs. So each one of them has, by default, it has a title. So we can use that as the content of the button. So take the button 1, text, content, and we'll equal that to the element title. So there's our buttons, and let's make the buttons clickable. And we'll also clear out the inner HTML of H1, so we don't have that JSON value there. And that we can do as soon as we select the H1. So that way we just have the buttons up here. We've added the title, and now we want to make the button active. So add an event listener to the button. And whenever the button gets clicked, then we want to launch to the my URL, sending over the object information. And we're going to also have the URL here within the element object. So launch the URL. And actually this just requires the full element object. So let's see what happens. We click the buttons, and we can dynamically load to the different endpoints. And I'll update the connection before we send it over to the maker. And from here, we can just use the URL that we connected to. So that will load the endpoints there, and then the data from the endpoints below. And let's do one quick more update to the button. So to make the buttons a little bit more like buttons, so bigger, updating the font size, and add some margin between the buttons, so 5 pixels. And I'll add to each one of these buttons that we're creating, and as we're looping through the buttons, add a class of button. And I think that turned out a little bit too big, a little bigger than I expected. So now we've got clickable buttons. I'm also going to update the border radius, so it's slightly rounded for the buttons. And there we go. So now it's up to you. You can make updates as needed on the page. The objective of this lesson is to practice. So there are some tasks that you should try out to dynamically load content from different JSON data and different web pages. and also troubleshooting, debugging of the JSON data to make sure that your structure is proper, and then outputting that content onto the page. Try out and check out the various data and error messages, debugging within the console, and then also using a lint option, and then load the various data points and output the content on the page.